name's Ashley. I've been dabbling in astrophotography for a while. So this is going to be kind of a brief tutorial, if you will, because teaching an astrophotography class can be a very long subject, even on just specific nuances of it. So we'll kind of focus on three aspects today. One of them is going to be taking photos of the moon. So how do I get better moon photos? And then photographing kind of the night sky. And then another one for star trails. So between those three topics are what we'll try and cover. Try and cover them kind of quickly, as quickly as I can here. But if you guys at the end want me to go into a little bit more detail on anything, feel free to ask questions as we go too. All right. Whoops. So I do have to pop this into the full mode. Sorry, Ward. We're going to have to hope that this doesn't get too distracting here. For some reason, my computer's acting kind of funky today, guys. So bear with me a little bit here. So we're going to do this. And then I'm just going to try and get this to go away. Whoops, wrong one. All right. So we'll quickly touch on some of the equipment needed for this. So astrophotography, I would say, is one of those topics that there is a fair amount of equipment that you need to really do it well. First thing, obviously, is a camera. We're going to want some sort of a camera. Ideally, an interchangeable lens camera is going to be best or yield the best results, if you will. Lenses. I have a wide-angle lens on here, but we'll talk about that. Depending on if I'm shooting the moon or shooting the night sky, it's going to basically decide for me what lens I want to focus on. Memory cards. Depending on how we want to go about shooting this, we're going to want something that's a higher capacity, and ideally something that's a faster read-write speed. As we get into astrophotography and start playing with it more and more, there's kind of two methods of doing this. There's one shot, where I'm taking just one photo, and then there's also stacking, where I can take multiple photos and basically throughout the night, taking them every 10 or 15 seconds, and then in software, sandwiching all of those together to create one image. If we start doing stacking stuff, we're going to actually want a higher capacity card and a faster card, just so that it can keep up with the constant data getting written to it. Just a quick 101 on memory cards. I chose this one because it has really all the things that you want to look for on it. So in the bottom right corner on that card, you see that V90. That's kind of an ideal thing we want to look at for speed. A lot of times that's more of a video-based feature, but what that's telling you is that the minimum write speed on that card is going to be 90 megs per second. So very, very fast. You'll see other options out there that might say like V30 or V10. They're just going to be a slower minimum write speed. The little numeral, Roman numeral 2 is telling you that it's a UHS 2 speed card. So again, a higher speed card for writing and reading from it. All right. Another thing that we want to make sure we've got is charged batteries. We're going to probably go through multiple batteries while we're out shooting. So ideally having 2 or 3 batteries with us throughout the night so that we can kind of swap them as we need and make sure that they're all fully charged. Likewise, we'll probably be shooting at night and it'll be a little colder, so the batteries aren't going to hold a charge quite as long. So we'll want to be able to swap them as we need to as well. Let me know if my screen on my side is looking kind of glitchy. So let me know if you guys are, if you're seeing that too. The other thing that we're going to look for, or that we want to invest in, is actually going to be a sturdy tripod. We want something that's going to be, ironically, heavy and not budge a whole lot, because we want it to be as stable as possible as we're out shooting. Especially with a lot of the astro stuff, we're going to be doing longer exposures. So things will be probably upwards of maybe 30 seconds, or sometimes if we're doing some star trails, maybe even an hour-long exposure. So we want to make sure that there's no movement seen in there as well. Shutter release cables. On this, I would opt to get something that's actually a corded version that goes into the camera. Problem with using some of the remote ones is it's always the most inopportune time that that battery dies on you. Same thing with if I have the option to use like an app on my phone to control the shutter. It works really well. The problem is that my phone always seems to be dead or almost dead. I need to use that feature. So a hard cabled shutter release cable is ideal for this. The other bonus I would say to do on this is if you go to the store and get some Velcro and put a piece of it on your tripod and a piece of it on that little trigger handle on the shutter release cable. And then you can stick that to the tripod. That way, if you're out at night shooting, it's not swinging around from the camera as well. It just stays right in place. Some of the other little pieces, bring something like a little camp chair or some kind of comfortable chair because we're going to be sitting for a while on a lot of these. Usually it's a lot of upfront work, getting everything set up, ready to go. And then once you press the button, you're just kind of sitting there waiting. So something comfortable to sit on. And also the other thing that I would point out would be a headlamp, preferably something that's dimmable or that has the option to have like an amber or a red light. The benefit of using that amber or red light is it's not going to harm your night vision as much. If you've ever been in the house at night, flip on the lights to go look at something, you flip them back off and now you can't see anything for like 10, 15, 20 seconds. Same thing when you're out in the dark. If we pop open our phone or a flashlight, anything like that, it's going to take us a lot longer to reacclimate. Whereas if we use that amber or that red light, it's not as harsh of a turnaround. All right. So unfortunately at the moment I can't see chat, but if you guys have questions, type them out. As soon as I get out of this view, I will start tackling some of those questions for you guys too. So some of the obstacles that we're going to run into with astrophotography, the biggest thing I would say that we're going to probably hit is going to be weather. It's the most fickle thing. You can have everything planned and ready to go, and then the weather changes and now you can't shoot. This might be a storm rolling in. Clouds typically are what's going to ruin it. They're going to come in and block your stars, block everything from you. So lots and lots of planning, and then lots of hoping that those plans fall through or the plans make it. Light pollution's the other biggest one. So being in some of the big city areas, the hard thing is that if I'm looking towards any major city, I'm going to have a lot of light leak in the background. So like in the picture that's up there, you can see all that kind of warmer light down at the horizon line there. A lot of that is city light. And then a lot of that, because this was actually in Alaska and during a time of the year where the sun never fully really set, you actually see some of that sun still in that photo too. Temperatures, another obstacle we're going to run into, and that's mainly that the best time of year to go shoot astro stuff is when it's cold, because you have less atmosphere in between you as well, so you get more detail, sharper images. So fall, winter are ideal times for astrophotography. The downside typically is that it gets colder. So batteries aren't going to run as longer. The other issue we run into is now everything's a digital camera, which means as it's running, it's building heat. So it's also going to start building moisture as well, as that heat is a different temperature from the cold air around it. And then time is the other biggest thing. Sometimes it might be that the ideal time for me to go out and shoot is going to be 1 a.m., you know, something like that when it gets incredibly dark. But I may have to work in the next morning, so I don't have the time to really sit out there all night. And sometimes if I'm doing a ton of images that I'm going to stack, the problem is that it just takes a long time to shoot all of those images, and it takes a lot of time to process all the images and stack all the images. So time's probably another big variable here. But I would say cloud cover and weather is probably your #1 problem. And then unless we have plans to go out to like Wyoming or North or South Dakota or something like that, light pollution is probably your second biggest problem that you'll run into. The other thing with light pollution, which we never really think about until we're out shooting, is the moon. The moon's a big, bright ball sitting up in the air, and it actually does cause a lot of light pollution as well. So now you kind of see you've got to time it with not a full moon in the sky, but then also not clouds coming through. You got to get away from the cities and things like that. So there's a lot of variables that we have to try and work around for the ideal shot. All right, so we're going to kind of tackle some of the different types of astrophotography. And this is where I'm going to actually switch back here, and then I'll be able to see your guys' comments here. So bear with me one second. There we go. Okay, so yeah, you guys are seeing all the weird little glitchy things. So just tackle a couple questions here before we move on. Yes, so on the Sonys, the multi-interface cable plug that you have is the same one that the shutter release cable would go into. So the same one that you would have if you have a USB charger or stuff like that. And then stacking, you hear about it in a couple different forms of photography. One of them being star stacking and the other one being like focus stacking. And it's really just for shooting multiple images without adjusting the camera at all. And then we're going to start layering all those images together in software to make one photo out of multiples. So if you even went to Google and just typed in star trail stacking, you'll see some over the top, tons of stars in a big streak. And that's just many, many, many photos all layered into one photo. All right. So a couple of things we're going to talk about today. Like I said, shooting the moon, shooting more of stars or Milky Way, and then star trails. All right. So let's jump into our first one here. So photographing the moon. So the moon is something that I hear more questions about than not, and it's usually people go to photograph it, and it's just a big, bright star in the sky, and you can't see any kind of detail, anything like that. It's just blown out, big, bright ball. And the trick here is that the moon is actually a lot brighter than we think it is. So we have to tackle this a little differently than we would normally shoot the sky. So when we're photographing the moon, we want as much of a telephoto lens as we can get, because the bigger the reach on the lens, the easier it's going to be to fill the frame with that moon. If we have a higher resolution camera, something that's like 42 megapixel, 50 megapixel, 60 megapixel, we can crop quite a bit on that frame to make up for what the lens can't do. But ideally, if we can get there with the lens, we're going to have more information to work with, more detail to work with. So on your camera, I would set it up to shoot in manual exposure. I would be on a tripod, and then I would start dialing in the variables here. So the first one is going to be my shutter speed. And I'm going to want to probably set that to about double what my focal length on my lens is. So if I have a 300 millimeter lens, I'm going to want like 1/600th of a second on my shutter speed. If I have like a 600 millimeter lens, I want 1/1200th of a second. And that's just so that I have a fast enough shutter speed that if I'm hand holding this, if I'm not on a tripod, I can hand hold it and it's not going to be blurry from my shake. The other thing I'll set is going to be my aperture. Ideally, I want this to be between 5.6 and f11. It just depends how much detail I want in there, but also how low I want to be able to keep my ISO. So the higher that aperture value goes, so if I go up to like an f11, f16, I'm cutting out more light, which we're going to need to do when we shoot the moon anyway. But I also want to try and make sure I don't have to push my ISO super high if I don't need to, if that makes sense. And then my ISO, I'm just going to balance it so that it balances out that exposure for me. So for shooting on a mirrorless camera, you'll be able to see all of this live through the viewfinder or through the back screen. So I can kind of dial in that exposure to where I need it to be. And what I would do is, let's turn on my camera here. Kind of walk you through what I would do here. So let's see here, switch cameras. All right, can you guys see my screen here on my camera?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, we can.
All right, so on the very bottom there, I have my shutter speed, my aperture, and my ISO right now set to auto, right? So if I have a 600 millimeter lens, we'll say, I'm gonna wanna set my shutter speed to like 1/1200th, 1/1250th, 1/1000th is even fine, just somewhere in that area. Depending on your lens, your aperture value, I'm gonna want to adjust this. Like I said, probably 5.6 is where I would start out. And as you're looking at the image, if it's still too bright, start making that adjustment and stop it down a little bit. Maybe go f8, maybe go f11. The other piece that we'll adjust on here is going to be that ISO. A lot of times I like to shoot and keep my ISO set to auto, so it'll just adjust as it needs to. So I can just set what limits I want it to work within. So I might say, you know, go between 100 and 10,000 ISO, wherever you need to go in that range. And then I don't really have to babysit the ISO, but it is another variable I can control if I want to dial that exposure in exactly where I want it. The other really nice thing here, so as we're looking at the moon, because it's nice and bright, it's going to actually be pretty easy for you to autofocus on it as well. So we can keep autofocus on. In a lot of other astrophotography though, I'm going to actually want to manually focus the lens. Now, have any of you guys tried to autofocus in the dark? It's usually not very easy, right? Because everything's kind of black, especially when you get outside and you're doing astro stuff. Everything's going to be super dark. You're not going to really have a point to focus upon. So there's a really cool feature in the Sony cameras. If we go into the menu on the camera, unfortunately, this is like a top secret hidden thing. So you actually have to set it as a custom button. So you'll have the custom key settings up at the top there. I'll move this piece out of the way here so I can see, maybe. There we go. So that custom key setting, if I go into here, I'm just gonna wanna pick a button to assign it to. I like to actually assign it to something I'm not gonna just bump on accident. So usually like that button on an A7 series camera that's up in the top left on the back. If I have an like A6000 series camera, it'll probably be one of the custom buttons that's up on the top. So like one of those two. But what I'll do, whoops, bumped the wrong button as I'm talking about not bumping the wrong button. But what I'll do is I'll go into that custom button and there's an option called bright monitoring. And what that's going to do is when I press that button, it's going to boost the exposure that I'm seeing in the viewfinder or on the back screen super bright. So it makes it really easy for me to manually focus and make sure all the points are sharp. I can typically see my foreground and things like that as well. So it makes it a lot easier for me to focus the camera. So that's kind of a cool feature that's in the Sony cameras. I'm going to jump back to a little presentation here. Oh, that looks kind of weird. Oh my goodness. Sorry guys, I am not good with the touchpad on this computer. All right. I'll move this thing out of the way here real quick. All right. So now let's talk about photographing like the Milky Way, photographing stars, things like that. So the settings here are going to be a little different. One of those differences is really going to be the lens I'm going to choose. I'm actually going to aim for the widest lens possible I have, as well as something bright. So if I'm on a crop sensor camera, that might be something like a 10 or 12 millimeter lens. If I can get it in a 1.8 aperture, or even a 2.8 aperture, that would work as well. In a full frame camera, this might be something like a 24 or a 20, or if it's available, a 16 millimeter lens. Again, just something as wide as possible, because I'm going to want to include some foreground in the image as well. So that's more of a frame of reference for the viewer. There we go. So we want a wide, bright lens. I'm still going to use a slower shutter speed. A lot of the kind of like Milky Way shots, things like that I'm shooting, my shutter speed is going to probably be somewhere around maybe 15 seconds or so. And this shutter speed is going to be really dependent upon how wide my lens is. The wider my lens is, the longer that exposure can go. So if I'm on a 24 millimeter and I can get 15 seconds, on a 20 I can probably get maybe 20 or 25 seconds. Yes, the 24-1.4 or the new 20 millimeter 21.8 would work absolutely fine for that. And then the crop sensor 24-1.8, it would work. It's probably not going to be quite as wide though. So you're just going to have to adjust where you're aiming and all of that. But yeah, it should work there though. Is there a rule for shutter speed and focal length? There's not really a hard and fast one. Some of it's a little bit of trial and error, to be honest with you. I know from my experiences when I've been shooting, on some of the lenses I had that were in like a 16 or 17 millimeter range, I could get away with about a 30-second exposure, as opposed to if I shoot something at like a 24 millimeter, I'm probably going to be closer to like that 15-second exposure. And the big difference here in those focal lengths is more lens compression. So the greater that focal length is, the flatter my image gets, but it's really kind of pulling that background closer to me, right? So the big trade-off here is as I pull that background closer, I'm going to see the stars move at a quicker pace. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about star trails, because that can be a way for me to cheat in star trails and get more movement out of the stars without having to go for a longer exposure. For your lens, at least I would say get something that can go to a f4. You can get away with less. It's just going to make it tougher to get totally sharp stars. So if we get into, like I'm going to jump back into here. If we look at this in really great detail, it's good, but we do have slight movement in the stars. So instead of them being just a small pin dot of light, it's a little short dash of light. So if we can get that exposure even just a little shorter on here, we'll have less movement and they'll just be little dots of light. And then our ISO, again, we're going to probably have to push it higher for this because we're going to try and get this shot in a 15-second exposure. So we're going to try and do this quicker. And because of that, we're going to have to probably push that ISO up higher. So a good starting point on a lot of this, if we can, I would say my shutter speed, I'd aim for about, again, depending on your lens, I'm going to aim for somewhere maybe around 15 seconds, 10 seconds. I'm going to set my aperture to, if you have it, 2.8. And then my ISO is probably going to start out at about 6400 and then dial it back as we need. A lot of this is variable depending on our camera that we're using, our lens setup, things like that. Oops. All right, and we'll talk about star trails here. Star trails are probably the most enjoyable thing I find to shoot. There's, again, two methods of doing this. One method is to take a whole bunch of shorter exposures, and then in software after the fact, stack all of those into just one photo. There's a software out there called Star Stacks. Basically, you can load in all of the images you took. It'll flatten them into one photo. The other method is to take simply just one photo that takes a very long exposure. So typically, I like to do it as just one photo, mainly for the challenge that's there, I find, because it becomes a little bit more problem solving, if you will. So like this image that we're looking at right here was, I want to say, about a 50-minute exposure. So that's basically sitting out there for an hour with a buddy in a camp chair and waiting for it to go. How many images are needed for a good stack? A lot of that comes down to how much movement you want to see. It's not uncommon to, because you're going to shoot about probably that same as we were talking about with the Milky Way, where you're shooting roughly maybe a 15 or 30-second exposure. It's not uncommon to have 100 or so of those and stack them all together. So for star trails, here's where it gets a little bit more tricky. So we're going to choose a focal length really based on my scene and based on how much movement I want to show over what period of time I can shoot for. Sounds weird, I know. So what we're going to end up doing, like let's say I have a 24 to 70 millimeter lens or something of that equivalent. If I start at 24, I'm going to have to shoot for a much longer shot to get the same amount of movement out of those stars compared to like a 70 millimeter. 70 millimeter, I can shoot much shorter, and the stars are going to move much further distance in that time. The problem is that I now either have to back way, way up to try and still fit my foreground in, or I'm going to have to try something else, a different composition altogether. So the way I like to go about this is a lot of times I still shoot this with a wide lens, and I just go for a long, long exposure. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put the camera typically into like aperture priority, and I'm going to find a 30-second exposure on the camera. So a lot of times this might be me setting my aperture as bright as I can get. So that might be like a 2.8, we'll say, on the lens. And I'm going to end up usually cranking my ISO way up. So let's say that's maybe 10,000 ISO for my 30-second exposure. But now I want this exposure to go, let's say, 30 minutes or so, right? So if we're familiar with stops of light, what I can start doing is every time I basically half that ISO, I'm going to double my exposure. So if I'm at 12,000 ISO and I go to 6,400 ISO, my 30-second exposure is now a minute. If I half it again, so I go to 3,200 ISO, I'm now at 2 minutes. If I half it again, I'm at 4 minutes, so on and so forth. Same thing with my aperture. As I stop that lens down, if I was at 2.8 and I now go to f4, I'm going to double that exposure time as well. So moving in full stop increments there, I can now extend that exposure out as long as I want. A lot of this is going to be dependent on how long your battery lasts, if your battery's fully charged, if it's cold, things like that. So a lot of times I will aim for them to be around 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour at most. And then what I would do is once I find my 30-second exposure, I might actually dial it back so it's just a hair darker than what looks good on the back screen. And that's going to help account for some of the light pollution and things like that in the image. So hopefully that wasn't too quick in the choppy math division here. But the easy thing to remember is we find our exposure for 30 seconds. And it's usually going to require me going to a really high ISO and a really bright opening on my lens to get there. And then I'm going to just start having those numbers to push that exposure out. So I'll find all of these in aperture priority. I'll find that 30-second exposure. And then what I'm going to do is switch over to manual. And then I can kind of plug in my variables. One of them being my shutter speed's now going to get set to bulb, B-U-L-B. And then what that means is on that shutter release cable, I can lock it open. It'll stay locked open until I unlock it. And then I can dial in my aperture, my ISO based off of what my quick math was. So that's kind of a nice, quick way to get this going. And then from there, I just set a timer on my phone so I can let the camera just go and shoot. And then I basically have to just entertain myself for the next 45 minutes. One thing to keep in mind is if we're shooting with in-camera noise reduction turned on, that's going to essentially double how long I have to wait to see that photo. So if we shoot in RAW, a lot of times I would say just turn noise reduction off, and you can do noise reduction in software. If you're shooting in JPEG, you're going to want to keep the noise reduction on. Downside is if I shot a 30-minute exposure, noise reduction is going to run for another 30 minutes after that. So that means in an hour, I get to see the photo I took. So it's a little like shooting film again, in a sense. The good and the bad of this, if we didn't plan ahead and you didn't fully charge your battery, you run the risk of your battery dying before that photo's done writing and losing the photo altogether. So that's kind of a negative there, which has happened to me once. That's all I needed to learn my lesson was the one time, fortunately. And then the other things just being, again, preparing. I can't stress that enough. You know, go survey your site ahead of time. Know where you're going to post up, where the stars are going to be. There's a lot of great resources out there. You have, if you go and you Google, what is it called, Dark Sky Tracker, it'll actually show you light pollution based on where you're at in the country. So you can actually see where you need to go to get to a dark part of the sky. So that's a very nice piece. You can even go to like NOAA, basically the weather resource, and you can watch the radar and check cloud coverage and things like that. There are a lot of very cool apps you can get on your phone. Let me get into my phone here real quick. The one that I use a lot is actually Skyview. And the cool thing with that is I can point the camera on my phone up in the sky. It'll show me what constellations are there, what stars are there. I can tell it I'm looking for something, and it'll guide me to where I'm looking for it. So I don't have to be super knowledgeable on where stars are and everything like that. But there's other kind of tracker devices that you can look at online that will tell you what's visible in the sky based on that, whatever date you punch in and whatever location you punch in. So if you said I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, and I want this date, it'll show you what you can actually view in the sky. The other piece, so when we look at something like this, the ideal is to get that North Star at kind of a focal point in the frame that you want. Because all these other stars that are streaking are going to be circling around that North Star. So just off basically the top right corner of the frame here is where that North Star was. And everything will be circling around that. So the downside is for a chunk of the year, you're not going to have visibility of that star. So if you wanted to do star trails, it just won't have that same effect. And I want to say for our area, like this time of year, the North Star is actually visible. So you can actually go out and shoot, assuming you don't have clouds and things like that covering you. And then hopefully this doesn't get all glitchy on us here again. So we're going to try and switch real quick. Go. All right. And so just some other things that the same kind of technique lends itself well to. If we do things like steel wool, where basically you're just taking some steel wool, putting it in a whisk, hooking it onto a rope or a chain, light it on fire, and you're doing a longer exposure here as well. And then all those little pieces going off are just little pieces of steel wool flying off of it as it's being spun around. Oh, there we go. So all year round, we can see it in our part of the country. Our part of the world, I should say. Oh, so my Northern Lights photo is not showing up. Sorry about that. Northern Lights is a very similar thing. With Northern Lights, it's going to probably be a much shorter shot, though. You're probably looking at maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3 seconds to get that same shot. Whereas like the steel wool shot that you're seeing there is a 15-second shot. Oops, I'm sure this is probably right in your guys' way. There we go. And then also things like painting with light, where we can do a longer exposure, we can write stuff with a sparkler, we can paint stuff with flashlights, things of that nature as well. So like on this shot, it was the couple standing, posing there, sparkler going across, and then they actually had popped the flash right at the end just to kind of freeze them in place. All right, cool. Any, we'll open this kind of up here now to you guys. Do you guys have any questions on anything? Get out of there. Oops, we'll go back to this guy. And let me pull up chat here too. Maybe. Come on, computer. There we go. There we go. Any questions that you guys have? Could be camera settings or any of that kind of stuff. Yeah, so on some of the shots, you can, the problem being that my foreground, unless I want it to be a silhouette, I do want to try and do something to light it. So a lot of times using a flashlight is simply the best. And then you can use colored gels and things like that to change the light of it. You can even get, in those gels, you can get density gels, which will knock down that light a little bit. And then you're going to basically just use that flashlight like a paintbrush and paint up the foreground. Noise reduction on short duration exposures, I would say depending on your ISO, but the long exposure noise reduction, if you're going to be going like 15 seconds or slower, it's probably not going to have as huge of an impact, but it'll have a much bigger impact if we're doing like a 20 or 30-minute exposure. For Northern Lights, a lot of times I'm probably, so this all depends kind of how close you are to it. If I'm, you know, kind of the iconic shots where it's right above me, it's bright, so you can actually get away with like a 2000 ISO, maybe a 3200 ISO. And if your lens will open up to like a 1.8 or a 2.8, that should be enough. Oh, nice. So camera company actually has the new 21.8 lens that Sony has too. It's supposed to be a very, very nice lens for astro. So yeah, actually, so on this, a lot of times I will probably still aim to shoot in RAW. And the main reason being that there's still a lot more exposure latitude with RAW. So if I need to push or pull that photo a little bit, it's a lot easier to do with RAW. The downside being if you're going to do stacking, those raw files get big. So they start filling up the card pretty quick, and it will actually fill up the computer pretty quick here too. So a lot of times if I'm doing a single shot, yeah, I'll still shoot raw just because there's a lot more exposure latitude. So yeah, landscapes and astro stuff I find is a big benefit with raw. Cool. Any other questions out there? Otherwise? Nope, and that's one for you, Ward. Is the store up or open for rental pickups?
Well, we're not doing rental pickups right now. We are, Tim Erickson and myself are at the Odana Road store from 10 to 4, Monday through Saturday. You could give Tim a call and see, he's been handling most of the phone calls, and see if he could arrange something like that. We have a table set up outside where we set things out on the table, then we go back in the store and you collect whatever's on the table. So he may be able to arrange that. I would give the store a call sometime between 10 and 4, and Tim will be more than happy to help you out.
There we go. All right. Well, there's still some light outside, so you guys can get to find yourself a location and get set up. Hopefully, I know here it's completely overcast, so that's no go tonight for me to shoot anything astro, but hopefully you guys might be able to. No worries. Len R. That I'm not familiar with. I know are you talking about when you're actually photographing it, or just tracking it so that you can go set up and shoot it? Oh, long exposure noise. That, depending on your lens, but yes, I think that could be helpful to you, because you're going to start getting into potentially like a 20 or 30-second long exposure. So it will be helpful. It'll just basically remove a lot of the multicolored kind of pixelation that you would see, or the noise that you would get in it. So you'll get a cleaner image with it on for sure. Yeah, if you're starting to go into multi-minute ones where you have a tracking piece, yeah, I would say keep noise reduction on, because waiting an extra 4 minutes is not that big of a deal. It's more of a nuisance when we get into like a star trail shot and we're going to shoot like 20 or 30 minutes, and then I have to wait another 20 or 30 minutes. But in a 4-minute shot, I would still leave it on, yeah. She's referring to long exposure noise reduction. And that's a feature that you have in your cameras that you can toggle on and off. Basically what it's saying is that if it does anything, on most cameras, I want to say that it's like anything longer than 2 seconds or something like that, that it'll basically apply noise reduction. And what it really does is it has your shot that it just took this really long exposure of, and then it basically snaps an image of just pure black, and it starts mapping them against each other. And then things that are like colored specks that'll start to essentially kind of take out of the frame. All right. Well, I'm going to let you guys have the rest of your day back. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Ashley. That was an excellent program. Really appreciate you doing that for us. Thanks,
Absolutely.
everyone. See you
Take
tomorrow, care, same time, same channel. Bye.